John Wayne refused to leave the set dying of cancer. What he did in his final film shocked Hollywood. The year was 1976. In a small studio on the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, California, an old man stood in front of a mirror. He was 69 years old. His left lung was gone, removed 12 years earlier in a surgery that should have killed him. His stomach ached constantly. His breath came short, and every step across the wooden floor sent a deep, slow pain through his chest. The makeup artist hovered beside him, unsure whether to speak. The director waited outside. 100 crew members waited on the set, and the old man just stood there, staring at his own reflection, at the deep lines carved into his face, at the eyes that had once belonged to the most famous cowboy in the world. He took a long breath. He put on his hat. He turned around, and he walked out to make what everyone, including himself, quietly believed would be his last film. His name was John Wayne. And what he was about to do in the next 8 weeks would leave Hollywood speechless, not because of the film, but because of what the man refused to admit, refused to stop, and refused to let anyone see. This is the story of the Shootist. It is the story of a dying legend who walked onto a movie set knowing the cancer was eating him alive, and who forced himself through every scene, every line, every agonizing hour, because he had made a promise to himself. A promise he would not break, even if it killed him. And by the end of this story, you will understand why the crew of that film never forgot what they witnessed. Why a young actor named Ron Howard cried in his car after his final scene. And why, decades later, when people talk about the greatest final performances in film history, one name always comes up first, the Duke. But to understand why what happened on that set was so extraordinary, you first have to understand the man who walked onto it. And you have to go back, all the way back, to a small town in Iowa in the spring of 1907. He wasn't born John Wayne. He was born Marion Robert Morrison. On May 26, 1907, in a little corner of Winterset, Iowa, in a house so modest that his mother later said you could hear the wind through the walls in winter. His father, Clyde, was a pharmacist with poor health and worse luck. His mother, Mary, was a sharp, hard-edged woman who never quite approved of anything Clyde did. And from the earliest moments of his life, young Marion lived between those two forces, a gentle, dreaming father and a stern, unforgiving mother. They called him Duke, not because of royalty, not because of anything glamorous. It was the family dog, a giant Airedale terrier who followed the boy everywhere through the dusty streets of their neighborhood. The local firemen started calling the dog Big Duke and the boy walking beside him Little Duke. Eventually, just Duke. Marion hated his real name. Marion was a girl's name, the other kids teased him. But Duke was strong. Duke was loyal. Duke was the name of a friend who never left his side. And the name stuck. For the rest of his life, anyone who truly knew him called him Duke. He himself once said that anyone who called him John didn't really know him at all. When he was 6, the family moved west. Chasing his father's failing health and their failing fortunes, they ended up in a small desert town in California called Palmdale, trying to run a homestead on land that could barely grow dust. It was brutal. The boy learned to ride horses before he learned to read properly. He learned what it meant to wake up before dawn, to work with his hands until they bled, to watch his father try and fail, and try again. He also learned something else, something that would shape the rest of his life. He learned what American men used to be, quiet, resilient, unbreakable. By the time he was a teenager, they had moved again, this time to Glendale, just outside Los Angeles. Duke was already tall, already broad-shouldered, already carrying himself with a quiet confidence that older men noticed. He was a star football player in high school. Smart, too. He got a scholarship to the University of Southern California. He was going to be a lawyer. That was the plan. Fate had other plans. One afternoon, body surfing at Newport Beach, he caught a wave wrong. He slammed into the sand shoulder first. The injury was bad. It tore apart his collarbone and shoulder. He couldn't play football anymore. He lost his scholarship. He lost his dreams of law school. He lost, it seemed, his future. So he took a summer job, hauling equipment on a movie set. It was 1926. He was 19 years old. He was just a kid, moving boxes and lifting lights, sweating through the long Hollywood days. And then one afternoon, a director named John Ford spotted him. Ford was a brilliant, difficult, drunken Irish genius who would go on to become one of the greatest directors in the history of cinema. He saw something in the tall kid carrying equipment, something he couldn't quite explain. He started giving him bit parts, tiny roles, an extra here, a stuntman there, and slowly a friendship began to form between the old cantankerous director and the young, quiet prop boy. A friendship that would last for more than 40 years. A friendship that would produce some of the greatest American films ever made. But before that friendship could bloom, Duke had to nearly destroy his own career. In 1930, another director, a man named Raoul Walsh, cast him in a massive epic western called The Big Trail. It was going to be the biggest film of the year. They gave him the lead. They gave him his new name, John Wayne, and they gave him his big chance. The film was a disaster. It flopped at the box office so catastrophically that the studio nearly went bankrupt. Duke was blamed. For the next 9 years, 9 long, bitter years, he was exiled to the deepest part of Hollywood hell. He made cheap, low-budget westerns, the kind that were filmed in a week, released in a drive-in, and forgotten in a month. He made over 60 of them, riding horses, shooting fake pistols, kissing forgettable actresses in front of painted backdrops. 9 years of watching his contemporaries become stars while he rotted in the backlot. Most men would have quit. Most men would have gone back to the homestead, back to football coaching, back to anything with dignity. But Duke didn't quit. He showed up to every single one of those cheap pictures. He learned his lines. He delivered them. He climbed on the horse. He drew his gun. He did the work. Every single day. For 9 years. And then, in 1939, John Ford, his old friend who had been watching all along, made a phone call. And everything changed. Ford was making a film called Stagecoach, a western about 9 strangers trapped together on a coach, crossing Apache territory. The studio wanted Gary Cooper. Ford wanted Duke. The studio said no. Ford insisted. He fought, threatened, pulled every string he had. And he won. Stagecoach was released. It became one of the most important films of the year. It saved the Western genre. It made John Wayne, finally at 32 years old, after 12 brutal years in the business, a star. He never looked back. Over the next 3 decades, he became the most famous cowboy in the world. He made over 170 films. He won the Academy Award for True Grit. He stood for an entire American idea, a tough, quiet, principled man who did what was right, who protected the weak, who didn't talk much but said exactly what he meant. To millions of Americans, especially the men who grew up in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, John Wayne wasn't just an actor. He was what a man was supposed to look like, walk like, speak like. And then, in 1964, everything changed again. It started with a cough. Just a cough at first. Duke had smoked 5 to 6 packs of cigarettes a day for most of his adult life. Every photograph of him from the 1940s and 50s showed a cigarette burning in his hand. He didn't think anything of it. Everyone smoked back then. The doctors on set handed them out between takes. The tobacco companies sent him free cases, but the cough got worse. And in September of 1964, the doctors found it. A tumor in his left lung, the size of a baseball. They told him he had weeks, maybe months to live. They gave him a choice. Either he could take a slow treatment and maybe see one more Christmas, or they could operate. Cut out the entire left lung and 4 ribs. It was a massive surgery, brutal, the kind most men didn't survive, let alone recover from. And even if he survived, he might never walk unaided again. He might never ride a horse again. He would certainly never be a movie star again. Duke listened. He nodded. He lit another cigarette. And he said, "Cut it out. The surgery took 7 hours." When he woke up, there was a scar running from his chest to his spine. He could barely breathe. His ribs were gone. One of his lungs was gone. And he was alive. For months, the studios kept it quiet. They called it the Big C, a euphemism for cancer. They didn't want to scare the fans. They didn't want to scare the investors, and they certainly didn't want to scare the man himself. But Duke did something then that nobody expected. Something that infuriated the studios, but that cemented him forever in the hearts of millions of Americans. He went public. He went on television. He sat in front of the cameras, hollow-cheeked and pale, and he told the country, yes, I had cancer. Yes, I survived it, and I want every American who hears this to go to the doctor. Get checked. Don't be afraid. I beat the big C, and you can too. Nobody did that in 1964. Cancer was a word whispered. It was a word of shame. Movie stars hid it. Executives hid it. Families hid it. And here was the biggest, toughest, manliest star in Hollywood, walking on national television and saying, I had it. I beat it. Go check yourselves. Doctors later estimated that Duke's public statement saved tens of thousands of American lives. Men who would never have gone to the doctor went. Men who would have died in silence got diagnosed. That one television appearance, one old cowboy telling the truth, may have done more good for American public health than any advertisement in history, and then he went back to work. He made 13 more films, 13, with one lung, in his late 50s and 60s. Films like True Grit, which finally won him the Oscar he had been denied for 40 years. Films like The Cowboys, Big Jake, Chisholm, Rooster Cogburn. He rode horses again. He fired his pistols again. He gave his speeches, the ones that tore through you like a shot of whiskey. And he walked through those movies like a man who had been given a second life and refused to waste it. But what nobody knew, what even his closest friends didn't know, was that the cancer had never truly left him. It had just gone quiet, sleeping, waiting, and in the spring of 1976, it came back. He was 68 years old when the doctors gave him the news again. The new tumor was in his stomach this time. It was aggressive. It was spreading. They said chemotherapy might slow it. Nothing would stop it, he nodded. He thanked them, and he walked out of the office. That same week, he received a script. It was called The Shootist. It was based on a novel by a man named Glendon Swarthout. It was about an old gunslinger named J.B. Books, who discovers he has terminal cancer, and who decides to die the way he lived, on his own terms, with a gun in his hand, in a saloon, facing down the men who want him dead. Duke read it in one sitting, then he read it again, then he picked up the phone, and he called the director, a man named Don Siegel. And he said 4 words that the director never forgot. I want to do it. Siegel was stunned. He knew about Duke's health. Everyone in Hollywood knew. And he thought Duke was insane. How could a man dying of cancer play a man dying of cancer? How could he get through 8 weeks of shooting? How could the insurance companies possibly approve it? They didn't approve it at first. The production was nearly shut down before it started. The insurance companies refused to cover him. Studios panicked. Lawyers wrote memos. Executives held emergency meetings. It wasn't worth the risk, they said. He could die on set. He could collapse during a scene. He could cost the production millions. Duke sat in those meetings, silent, listening. And when it was over, he said one thing. If you don't insure this film, I'll pay for it myself. The film got made. The shooting began in January of 1976 in Carson City, Nevada. It was cold. Brutally cold. The kind of winter that cuts through wool and bone. Duke arrived on set the first day wearing a long black coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, and a cigarette burning between his fingers, even though the doctors had told him 1,000 times to stop. He got off the truck. He walked to the director. He shook his hand. And he said, let's get to work. The director later described that first day as one of the strangest of his career. Because Duke moved slowly. He moved carefully. Every step was calculated. The crew noticed. The other actors noticed. But nobody said anything. Because Duke was Duke, and you didn't say anything to Duke. But when the cameras rolled, something happened. It was like the years fell away. It was like the cancer didn't exist. The man who had hobbled onto the set straightened. The man who had been short of breath spoke with thunder in his voice. He delivered his lines the way he had delivered them 50 years before, in the dusty backlots of Poverty Row, except now every word carried the weight of a lifetime. The cast watched him and wondered if they were witnessing a miracle or a ghost. One of those cast members was a young man named Ron Howard. He was 22 years old. He had grown up watching John Wayne movies. His father had taken him to see them at the drive-in. And now here he was, standing next to his childhood hero, playing his son in the film. And Ron Howard was terrified. He later said he could barely remember his first lines because he was so intimidated. Duke saw it. Duke saw the kid's hands shaking. In between takes, he walked over, put his massive hand on Ron Howard's shoulder and said, "Son, you're doing fine. Just look me in the eye. Say your lines. We're just two actors in a room." That's all. Ron Howard later said it was one of the most important moments of his life. That quiet reassurance. From a dying man to a kid who didn't know what he was doing. 30 years later, when Ron Howard had become one of the most successful directors in Hollywood, he was interviewed about his early career. He talked about working with Duke, and his eyes filled with tears. He said, "You have to understand. He was in pain every day, and he never showed it. Not once. The crew began to notice things. Duke would arrive on set an hour early. He would sit in his trailer alone. The makeup artist, a woman named Dottie, would come in quietly. She would find him sitting there, his hands pressed against his stomach, his face pale. He would look up and smile. He would say, "Morning, Dottie. Let's make me look like a cowboy." He would stand up slowly. He would walk to the makeup chair. He would sit. He would let her work. And after she was done, he would look in the mirror and he would say, "Good job, kid. Let's go." Then he would walk onto the set. And he would become John Wayne again. But sometimes, between takes, when he thought nobody was watching, the crew would see him. They would see him lean against a wall. They would see him close his eyes. They would see him breathe slowly, carefully, the way a man breathes when every breath hurts. They would see him take out a small bottle of pills, swallow one, and put the bottle back in his pocket. And then they would hear the director call his name. And he would straighten, and he would walk back onto the set. And he would be Duke again. The co-star of the film, Lauren Bacall, later wrote about it in her memoir. Bacall was no stranger to strong men. She had been married to Humphrey Bogart. She had watched Bogart die of esophageal cancer in 1957. She knew what a dying man looked like. She knew how cancer moved. She knew the particular way the pain changed a person's face. She saw all of that in Duke from day one, but Duke never spoke about it, never mentioned it, never complained. She said it was the most extraordinary display of quiet courage she had ever witnessed in her life. She had loved one dying man. Now she was acting across from another. And she said Duke carried it with a dignity that she could not put into words. One day they were shooting a scene together. Bacall's character was a widow who had taken Duke's gunslinger into her boarding house. She was falling in love with him, even though she knew he was dying. It was a tender scene. A quiet scene. Two people sitting at a dinner table speaking softly about life and loss. In the middle of the take, Duke coughed. It wasn't written in the script. It was real. He coughed and he turned his head, and a small amount of blood came up onto the napkin he was holding. He stared at it for a moment. Bacall stared too. The director called cut. Duke stood up. He walked to the corner of the room. He wiped his mouth. He threw the napkin away. He turned around, and he said, "Let's go again." The director nodded. The cameras rolled, and he did the scene again, perfectly, as if nothing had happened. That night, Bacall went back to her hotel room, and she cried. She wrote in her diary that she had never met a man like him, that she wasn't sure they made men like him anymore. There were moments, quiet, small moments, that the crew remembered for the rest of their lives. One afternoon, Duke was supposed to ride a horse through the town square. It was a simple scene. He had done it 1,000 times in 1,000 other movies. But when he tried to swing up into the saddle that day, something in his chest gave way. The pain was so sharp that he nearly fell. The stuntman ran forward to help him. Duke waved him off. He gripped the saddle horn. He pulled himself up. He sat on the horse. He adjusted his hat. He looked down at the director and he said, "Action whenever you're ready." The director called action. And Duke rode down the street like he had ridden down 100 streets before, upright, commanding, a cowboy. The camera caught nothing of the pain. The film showed nothing of the cost. When you watch that scene today, and millions of people still do, you see a legend riding into town. You don't see a man who almost didn't make it onto the horse. On another day, they were shooting the famous saloon scene, the final shootout. Duke's character walks into a bar. He sits down at a table. He waits. 3 men come in, each one a gunfighter who has come to kill him. They draw, he draws. And in the ending, and this is important, his character dies. Shot in the back by the bartender after he has killed all 3 of his opponents. A hero's death. A tragic death. A clean Western death. The scene took 2 days to film. Duke had to draw his gun dozens of times. He had to fall to the floor. He had to lie there, bleeding, dying as the camera moved across his face. For 2 days, a 69-year-old man with stomach cancer fell to a hardwood floor, take after take, without complaint. He didn't ask for padding. He didn't ask for a stunt double. He did it himself. Again and again and again. On the 2nd day, during the 8th or 9th take of the fall, one of the young crew members, a kid not more than 20 years old, burst into tears. He ran out of the set. The director found him outside, sitting on the curb, his head in his hands. The kid looked up and he said, "He's dying. He's really dying. And he's doing this anyway." The director sat down next to him. He put his arm around the kid's shoulder. And he said, "I know, son. That's why we have to get this right." There was one moment, near the end of the shoot, that the cast never spoke about publicly for years. It happened on a quiet Friday afternoon. They had just finished a long day. The lighting crew was breaking down the set. Duke was sitting in a chair alone, watching them work. His cigarette was burning slowly. His hat was tilted back. He was staring at the empty saloon set like a man watching a dream. A young actress walked up to him. She was 19 or 20. It was her first major role. She had been afraid to speak to him all shoot. She finally found the courage. She asked him, "Mr. Wayne, are you scared?" "About what's happening?" He looked at her for a long moment. He took a slow drag on his cigarette. He blew the smoke out sideways, away from her face. And he smiled. He said, "Darling, I've been in front of that camera for 50 years. I've died on screen maybe 100 times. And every time I walked away. But one of these days, I'm not going to walk away. That's how it ends for all of us. You don't get to pick the day. You just get to pick how you face it." He paused. He looked at the empty set. He said, "And I decided a long time ago how I was going to face it." Then he put out his cigarette. He patted her hand. He stood up. He walked off the set. The actress later became a director. She told that story to every young actor she ever worked with. She said it was the most important lesson she ever learned in Hollywood. Not about acting. About living. The Shootist wrapped in March of 1976. Duke went home. He rested. He saw his family. He saw his children. He saw his grandchildren. He went out on his boat, the Wild Goose, and he sat on the deck and he watched the ocean. People said he looked at peace. People said he looked like a man who had done what he came to do. The film was released in August of 1976. It was a critical triumph. Critics called it one of the greatest westerns of all time. They said John Wayne had given the performance of his life. They said the ending, the old gunslinger dying on a barroom floor after facing down his killers, was one of the most powerful finales in cinema history. Duke saw the film once, at a private screening with his family. When the lights came up, he didn't say anything. He just nodded. He stood. He put on his coat. He left. His son Michael later said that his father seemed quietly satisfied, as if a piece of work he had been waiting to finish was finally done. 3 years later, on June 11th, 1979, John Wayne died. He was 72 years old. The cancer that had returned in 1976 had never truly gone away. It spread to his intestines, to his liver. Finally, mercifully, it took him. But what nobody knew at the time, what only came out in the years that followed, was how much pain he had been in during the filming of The Shootist. The doctor's records, released years later by his family, showed that during those 8 weeks of filming, he should have been in a hospital bed. By every medical measurement, by every rational standard, he should not have been on a horse. He should not have been firing pistols. He should not have been falling to a hardwood floor 20 times in a single afternoon. But he did it anyway. He did it because he had decided, a long time ago, how he was going to face it. In the years since, The Shootist has become more than just a film. It has become a kind of prayer. A sacred object. A final statement from a man who knew he was saying goodbye and wanted to say it on his own terms. Watch the film today. Watch it knowing what you now know. Watch it as a man dying of cancer plays a man dying of cancer. Watch him walk into that saloon in the final scene. Watch him sit down. Watch him order his last drink. Watch him face down the men who have come to kill him. Watch the look in his eyes as he draws his gun, one last time. That isn't acting. Not entirely. That's a man rehearsing his own farewell. Ron Howard, decades later, directing films that would win Academy Awards, was asked once what the greatest lesson of his career had been. He didn't talk about technique. He didn't talk about cinematography. He didn't talk about screenwriting. He talked about an old cowboy in a cold Nevada studio in 1976. He talked about a man who put his hand on a terrified kid's shoulder and said, "Son, you're doing fine." He talked about a man who never complained, who never asked for sympathy, who did the work. He said, "I learned what it means to show up, even when you're dying, even when nobody would blame you for staying home. You show up. You do your job. You take care of the people around you." That's what he taught me. That's what he taught all of us. There is a story, and nobody knows if it is true because Duke never confirmed it, and those who were there never wrote it down. But the legend goes like this. It is said that on the final day of shooting, after the last take, after the director called cut for the last time, Duke walked slowly to the center of the set. He stood there for a moment. He looked around. He looked at the fake saloon, at the fake windows, at the fake bar, at the crew who had all stopped working, because they all sensed something. He took off his hat, he held it against his chest, he bowed his head, and, so the story goes, the entire crew, without a word, did the same thing. 100 people, in complete silence, in that small Nevada studio, standing with their heads bowed, saying goodbye to the man and to the era that was ending with him. Then Duke put his hat back on. He smiled. He said, "Thanks, boys." And he walked off the set into the California afternoon for the last time. Whether the story is true or not, people still tell it. And every time they tell it, a new generation of listeners sits in silence and wonders what it takes to live like that. What it takes to die like that. They don't make men like the Duke anymore. Or maybe they do. Maybe somewhere, right now, in a small town somewhere in America, a young man is learning to ride a horse. A young man is learning to keep his word. A young man is learning to face down pain with a straight back and a quiet smile. Maybe he is watching an old movie on a Sunday afternoon. Maybe he is watching the final scene of The Shootist. Maybe he is seeing for the first time what a man is supposed to look like. If so, Duke would be glad, because that was why he did it. All of it, every film, every fall, every ride, every line delivered in the agony of his final weeks. He did it for that boy. He did it for you. He did it for a country that has always needed to remember, even when it forgets, what real courage looks like. And real courage, as John Wayne taught us, is not the absence of fear. Real courage is a dying man climbing onto a horse. Real courage is an old cowboy walking into a saloon, knowing he will not walk out. Real courage is facing it, whatever it is, on your own terms. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a father or a grandfather or a man you once knew, please take a moment to subscribe. We have more stories coming. Stories of the men who built Hollywood. Stories of the West that was. Stories of the Duke and the men who rode beside him. Stories that nobody tells anymore, because nobody remembers them the way they should be remembered. Until next time, keep your powder dry, keep your word good, and ride tall in the saddle. The Duke would have wanted it that way.